The call begins with a man fighting for air, the words tumbling as if they might outrun what he has seen. On the night of the 7th of June 2021, at a private hunting estate in South Carolina, Alex Murdaugh tells the 911 operator that his wife and youngest son are down by the kennels, that there is blood everywhere, that someone has done something terrible. Blue lights spill across gravel and grass. Night insects hum like static. A family name that once opened every door in the Low Country is suddenly pressed flat against the earth. Minutes before the murders, a video recorded at those dog kennels will capture 3 familiar voices: Paul's, Maggie's, and Alex's, an ordinary, domestic moment preserved inside a phone that becomes a witness no one can intimidate. Later, prosecutors will say that video strips away the only refuge Alex claimed that night, that he wasn't there when the gunfire started. In court, they will replay it again and again, the timbre of a father's voice hanging in the humid air, the smallest sound cracking the largest defense. For a century, the Murdaughs were not merely lawyers, they were a dynasty of law. Power lived in their handshakes and lingered in the wood-paneled courtrooms where verdicts once felt like foregone conclusions. But beneath the manicured lawns and the easy charm of Southern privilege, cracks had already spread like roots under the foundation addiction, and money siphoned in the dark, a son facing trial for a deadly boat crash, lawsuits and secrets threading through the family's carefully curated story. On a summer night when the air itself seemed heavy, those hidden pressures found their release in 2 kinds of gunfire, and a silence so complete it sounded like the world holding its breath. When the officers arrive, they sweep the beams of their flashlights over boot prints, tire tracks, shell casings, the mundane debris of a life that has just become a crime scene. Somewhere between the first siren and the first photograph, grief and performance begin to blur. And somewhere on a charging dock, a phone contains the most inconvenient truth of all, that the story of a shocked husband discovering his dead is not the story that happened. The question is not only who pulled the triggers, it is why a man who had everything would choose a path that ends with blood on his hands, and his name recast from legacy to curse. Sometimes evil does not arrive as an intruder. Sometimes it lives at home, wears our clothes, borrows our voice, and waits for the lights to go out. In the heart of South Carolina's Low Country lies Hampton County, a land of marshes, oaks, and quiet reverence for one name, Murdaugh. For more than a century, that name was synonymous with power, justice, and privilege. Since 1910, 3 generations of Murdaugh men had served as solicitors, the Southern term for district attorneys, controlling who was charged, who was spared, and who prospered in the local courts. Their portraits hung in courthouses like saints of a secular religion. If you lived in Hampton County, you didn't cross the Murdaughs. You called them when you needed saving. To the world, Alex Murdaugh was the charming heir of this empire, tall, red-haired, and always ready with a smile. He inherited not only wealth, but influence, connections, and a last name that opened every door. He ran the family law firm, PED, alongside his brothers, handling personal injury cases that brought in millions. Everyone knew the Murdaughs drove nice cars, owned hunting dogs, and lived on vast properties. But most never saw beyond the image, a man of the South, family-oriented, loyal, and generous. Their estate, Moselle, stretched across 1,700 acres of woods, rivers, and farmland. It was a world apart, a southern Eden, where the Murdaughs hunted, hosted friends, and lived behind the comfort of isolation. Alex's wife, Maggie, was the warm heart of the family, elegant, social, a mother devoted to her 2 sons. Their eldest, Buster, was the golden child, athletic, smart, the one who would inherit the Murdaugh name. Their youngest, Paul, was wild, charming, but reckless, carrying the confidence of a boy who knew his last name could fix anything. In photographs, they looked untouchable, a family smiling at sunset, hunting rifles propped on a 4-wheeler, a golden retriever at their feet. But even in those perfect frames, there were shadows. Alex's colleagues whispered about money problems, unexplained debts, growing pressures. Paul's drinking had turned dangerous. And Maggie, though she smiled for the pictures, had begun to distance herself, spending more time at the beach house, away from Moselle's tense quiet. Still, to the community, the Murdaughs were royalty. They sponsored the local baseball team, donated to the sheriff's office, attended church on Sundays. When Alex walked into a courtroom, judges greeted him by first name. When the Murdaugh boys got into trouble, cases seemed to disappear. Power didn't just protect them, it blinded them. In Hampton County, a neighbor once said, "The law didn't belong to the people, it belonged to the Murdaughs." But even kingdoms built on fear and favor have foundations that crack. By 2019, those cracks had turned into fissures. Paul's drinking, once dismissed as youthful energy, led to tragedy. Alex's secrets with money and addiction began to pile up behind his confident smile. And the world that had always bent to the Murdaugh's will was about to bend back. It began like any other night for a group of young friends' laughter, music, and the reckless confidence that only comes when youth believes itself invincible. But for Paul Murdaugh, the youngest son of Alex, the night of the 23rd of February 2019 would carve the first deep fracture into the family empire that had stood untouchable for generations. The group had been out on the Beaufort River, celebrating, drinking, drifting from one dockside bar to another. Paul, just 19, insisted on driving his family's 17-foot sea hunt boat. He was already drunk, stumbling, loud, but adamant that no one else would take the wheel. His friends begged him to stop. One of them remembered him laughing, slurring. "You can't tell me what to do. You know who my family is." It was 2:20 a.m. when the boat slammed into a bridge piling near Archer's Creek. The sound was like an explosion in the still night. Bodies flew into the cold water. When the chaos settled, one name was missing. Mallory Beach, 19 years old, Paul's friend, bright, kind, beloved. For 8 days, search teams combed the river. The media descended on the lowcountry. When Mallory's body was finally found, face down miles downstream, the Murdaugh name was on every headline for the first time, not as prestigious attorneys, but as a synonym for cover-up. Because even in tragedy, the family's influence moved quickly. Police reports blurred details. At the hospital, witnesses said Alex Murdaugh and his father Randolph arrived before investigators, telling the teens not to speak to police. Paul's blood alcohol level was 3 times the legal limit, yet no arrest was made for weeks. It was the first time the public glimpsed what insiders had always known, that justice bent around the Murdaughs. But this time, the world was watching, and the mask began to slip. Behind closed doors, the pressure fractured the family. Paul faced manslaughter charges. Maggie grew more distant, embarrassed by the media storm. Alex spiraled further into opioid addiction and financial ruin, trying to hold together the facade of control. He mortgaged property, borrowed from his own clients' settlements, and hid debts even from his partners. The whispers in Hampton County grew louder. The Murdaughs aren't what they used to be. The dynasty, once feared and revered, had begun to rot from the inside. Meanwhile, online outrage erupted. Mallory's friends spoke publicly. Her family demanded accountability. And for the first time, people weren't afraid to say what they had long felt, that the Murdaugh name no longer meant law, but lawlessness. Even so, Alex believed he could still control the narrative. He hired lawyers, spun stories, and convinced himself that his last name was still bulletproof. But reputations crumble slowly, and then all at once, by mid-2021, the walls were closing in. The law firm was auditing missing funds. Paul's criminal trial loomed. The debts were unpayable. And Maggie, according to messages later found on her phone, had begun to fear her husband. "Something's off with Alex," she confided to a friend. "I don't know what's going on, but it's bad." The night of the 7th of June 2021 was supposed to be ordinary. Paul had returned home. Maggie had been coaxed to come to Moselle. The air was still. The dogs barked near the kennels. And then, in a moment of unimaginable violence, the story of the Murdaughs turned into legend, not of law and justice, but of blood and betrayal. When detectives returned to Moselle in the days following the murders, they weren't just walking into a crime scene. They were stepping into a maze of power, deceit, and secrets that had been built over decades. Alex Murdaugh, once the man everyone called when they needed help with the law, was now standing under its harshest light. In the first hours, he played the role of the shattered husband, his voice trembling, his hands still smeared with blood, whispering that someone must have come to hurt his family. But as the hours turned into days, that performance began to crack. He told police he had been visiting his mother that night, an elderly woman with dementia who could hardly remember the day of the week, and that when he came home he found Maggie and Paul shot dead by the dog kennels. It sounded believable, at least for a while. Then investigators found a video on Paul's phone, recorded at 8:44 p.m., only minutes before the murders. In that clip, Paul's friend can be heard speaking, the dogs barking, Maggie laughing, and Alex's voice clearly in the background. The one thing he had denied being there was proven false by his own son's phone. The video stripped away the story he had tried to build. It wasn't the work of an intruder. Alex had been there all along. From that moment, the mask was gone. The man once considered a pillar of the community was now a suspect in the slaughter of his own family. Investigators pressed harder. Gunshot residue was found on Alex's clothes and hands. The weapons used matched firearms owned by the Murdaughs, one of which Alex claimed had mysteriously vanished. And in every interview, his answers shifted just enough to feel rehearsed, not remembered. The timeline he offered no longer fit the data from his car, his phone, or the movements of his victims. When detectives widened their focus, the rot beneath the surface became visible. They began looking not at the man, but at his money, and what they found turned the case from tragedy into revelation. At the family law firm, accountants uncovered missing funds hundreds of thousands of dollars at first, then millions. Alex had been quietly siphoning client settlements for over a decade, forging signatures, creating fake accounts, and stealing from those he had sworn to protect. His life of luxury, the houses, the private school tuition, the endless hunting trips, had been built not from success, but from theft. Behind the polite smile and red tie, he had been drowning in debt and addiction. He bought opioids in bulk, fed lies to partners, and borrowed against a future that was already gone. By mid-2021, his firm had begun to suspect him. The financial pressure was unbearable. His world was collapsing, and the murders of Maggie and Paul would soon look less like a mystery and more like an act of desperation. But as investigators kept digging, they discovered that the bloodshed at Moselle wasn't the only darkness tied to the Murdaugh name. Years before the killings, there were other deaths that didn't make sense. In 2015, a young man named Stephen Smith was found dead on a lonely stretch of road not far from Moselle. The coroner called it a hit and run, yet there were no skid marks, no debris, and his body bore no injuries consistent with being struck by a car. He had been a classmate of Buster Murdaugh. Rumors spread quietly, and whispers of a cover-up hung over the town like humidity, thick, heavy, and impossible to ignore. Then came 2018. The Murdaugh's longtime housekeeper, Gloria Satterfield, reportedly fell on the steps of the family home and later died from her injuries. Alex told her sons he'd help them collect insurance money. They believed him. Instead, he pocketed the settlement more than $4 million through a web of fraudulent checks and fake accounts. It was a theft from the dead, committed under the guise of compassion. By 2021, everything Alex touched had begun to unravel. His wife knew about the money, his firm was closing in, his addiction was no longer a secret. The illusion of control of being a Murdaugh was evaporating. In September that same year, just months after the murders, he tried one final con. He staged his own shooting on a rural roadside, hoping to make it look like a murder so that his surviving son, Buster, could collect a $10 million insurance payout. The bullet only grazed his head. The shooter turned out to be a distant cousin he had hired himself. That was the end of the story. Alex Murdaugh tried to write one where he could die a tragic figure and leave behind a fortune. But the story that remained was uglier, truer, and far from finished. By the time police gathered all the threads, the phone video, the residue, the money, the lies, the image of a grieving father had fully disintegrated. What remained was a man who had built his life on manipulation and deceit until there was nothing left to protect but the illusion itself. And as the indictment came down in 2022, the once untouchable Murdaugh dynasty faced its reckoning. The courtroom that had always belonged to their family was now the stage of their ruin. The man who had once defined justice in Hampton County was about to stand trial for murder. By early 2023, the eyes of America turned to a single courtroom in Walterboro, South Carolina. The red brick courthouse, draped in Spanish moss and summer heat, became the stage for one of the most publicized trials in modern history. Inside sat Alex Murdaugh, the last heir of a Southern dynasty, now wearing a prison jumpsuit instead of a tailored suit. Cameras lined the walls. Reporters filled the benches. The nation that once admired the Murdaugh name now came to witness its destruction. For 6 long weeks, the prosecution built its story piece by piece, not of a random killing, but of a man cornered by his own greed and fear. They described a desperate father facing financial ruin, a looming scandal, and a criminal investigation that threatened to strip away everything he owned. On the night of the 7th of June 2021, they said, he made a calculated choice: to kill his wife and son to buy time, to gain sympathy, to cover his tracks. The jury listened to the 911 call again and again, Alex's voice shaking, his cries echoing through the speakers. Then came the video from Paul's phone, the one recorded just minutes before the murders, capturing Alex's voice near the kennels. It was irrefutable. His alibi collapsed with a single word: here. That's him, the prosecutor said, pointing at the defendant. The man who said he wasn't there yet, there he is, in his own son's final moments. When Alex took the stand in his own defense, the room went silent. It was a gamble, one that only a man used to controlling a courtroom would dare take. He admitted to lying to investigators, to stealing millions, to being addicted to opioids, but he swore he didn't kill his family. He wept, he pleaded. He said he'd been in the throes of paranoia. His tears didn't move the jury. Every lie he confessed to became another weight pulling his testimony under. The jurors saw not a grieving man, but a master manipulator who had finally run out of stories to tell. The defense tried to cast out no murder weapon recovered, no eyewitness, no direct confession, but the web of deceit was too thick to untangle. The digital data, the forensic evidence, the motive, they all converged on one man. During closing arguments, the prosecutor's voice cut through the quiet. For 100 years, the Murdaughs stood above the law, but not today. Today, justice belongs to everyone, even in Hampton County. After less than 3 hours of deliberation, the jury returned with its verdict, guilty on all counts the murders of Maggie and Paul. As the words were read, Alex stood motionless. The courtroom buzzed, reporters typing, spectators whispering. The man who had once controlled verdicts with a nod now listened to one he could not escape. The judge looked down from the bench and said, "You have lived a life of privilege, but it was all built on lies. It is one of the most troubling cases this court has ever seen." Then came the sentence: life in prison without parole. Outside, rain began to fall, tapping against the courthouse steps like a metronome, marking the end of a century-long reign. The Murdaugh dynasty, the family that had defined justice in the Lowcountry, was over. As Alex was led away, cuffed and silent, the camera lights flashed like lightning. The image of his bowed head spread across every screen in America, a living symbol of how power, once unchecked, always turns inward to destroy itself. The verdict was supposed to be the end, the final line under a century of privilege, lies, and blood. But in Hampton County, the ghost of the Murdaugh name still lingers like the humidity, thick and impossible to ignore. The Moselle estate stands silent now. Once a proud monument to Southern success, it is an empty shell, its hunting fields overgrown, the kennels abandoned, the air heavy with the memory of screams that will never fade. Weeds creep up the walls where the Murdaughs once held parties. Inside, dust settles on family portraits that no one has the courage to take down. The family law firm, PMPED, changed its name, trying to erase the stain of its founding dynasty. But the echo remains in the marble halls and the whispers of those who once looked to the Murdaughs for protection and instead found corruption. Even now, the ripples of their downfall continue to spread. New charges, new lawsuits, new questions about how many people suffered under their influence. Each revelation feels like another bone unearthed from the soil of South Carolina, proof that what looked noble was always built on decay. In interviews from prison, Alex Murdaugh still insists he's innocent. He smiles occasionally, the same practiced charm that once won juries and clients. But behind that smile lies a hollow truth that power had devoured him long before the murders ever happened. His surviving son, Buster, lives quietly, far from Hampton County. For him, the Murdaugh name is no longer an inheritance, but a cursory reminder that sometimes the worst prisons aren't built from concrete, but from legacy. The story of the Murdaughs is not just about murder. It is about the illusion of invincibility, and what happens when men who believe they are above the law finally face it. It's about how evil doesn't always arrive with a weapon in hand. Sometimes it hides behind good manners and Southern charms, smiling across a dinner table. The Murdaugh name once opened every door in the South, one local journalist wrote. Now it opens only old wounds. At dusk, the fields of Moselle are quiet. The sun sinks low, turning the grass to gold one last time before it fades into shadow. If you listen closely, you can still hear the echoes of the laughter, the gunfire, the phone call, the lies. The empire didn't fall by force. It collapsed from within. And in that collapse, the world was reminded of something simple and terrible, that no name, no wealth, no history can stand forever against the truth. This was not just the fall of a man, the prosecutor said at the end. It was the fall of a dynasty that thought it could outrun justice.